podcasts. And as you can see, I'm trying a variation with a few visual cues and uses and what have you, to see if this is preferable to the previous style, and you can let me know which approach you prefer. So for this session, we're going to look at Duir, the oak tree, the letter D, which is the seventh letter in the Ogham alphabet. So we'll go through some of the imagery associated with it and discuss some of the ideas and possible interpretations, whether you're looking at Duir appearing in poetry, either existing poetry that somebody else has written, or in poetry that you yourself want to create, or storytelling, mythology, or for use in divination, or for use with magic, chanting, folk, and that sort of thing. So we start with the birds, Ogham, which is the drone, the wren. Now, the wren doesn't appear a huge amount in surviving Irish or Welsh mythology. One of the key stories in which the wren appears is one that crops up in a number of different locations around Europe. Just kind of one of these stories that crops up in different cultures, which is the story associated with the Parliament of Birds. And the notion underpinning that story is that all of the birds gather together in a parliament, and they squawk and chirrup and chirp and cluck and what have you, and make as much noise as actual politicians gathered in a parliament. And they debate who should be the king or queen of the birds, who should be the new leader of the birds. And every bird says, well, I should be because of this reason or that reason. And they're all sort of squawking at each other. And then somebody eventually suggests that the best way of resolving this is to have a flying contest, because obviously they're birds, and that's what birds do. And suggests that they all fly as high as they can get, and whichever bird can fly the absolute highest. They are clearly the strongest bird, the one with the most powerful wings, and they should be the king or the queen. Which no doubt the birds with the smaller wings complain about, but the birds with the bigger wings get their own way. And so they all fly up in the air, and they go higher and higher and higher, and every so often one of them drops out because they can't go any higher, and the bigger birds get higher and higher and higher, until the only bird left flying is the eagle, which has an enormous wingspan, and it gets as high up as it possibly can get, and its wings can, the bird's so exhausted its wings can't carry it any higher. And the eagle bellows, I am the king of the birds because I am highest. Whereupon a little voice chirps up, oh no, you're not. And the wren, who has been hiding on the eagle's back, flaps up a few extra feet higher than the eagle, which is, I say, at its limit of the height it can get. And so the wren becomes the king of the birds, not through huge muscle power and strength, but through cunning, through wit, through knowledge and sort of thinking ahead. And so one of the smallest birds and the least colourful birds and so on ends up as the king of the birds. It's meant to be a humorous story, but there's also the undertone there that leadership is less about muscle power, who's the biggest, the burliest, the strongest, the loudest, more about intelligence and nous, who can use their brain the best. And if you want to be a little bit cynical and maybe have a bit of a Marxist thing going on there, then you can also suggest that it's an implication of the story that the royalty and the aristocracy, the leaders of society, are carried up on the coattails of others who are stronger than they are. It's just that the ones in charge of society know how to exploit those underneath them. Exploit those who have greater strengths, and that's what keeps the powerful is the strength of those beneath them. Something that perhaps is coming a little bit to the fore at the moment with coronavirus, and this sense that so many businesses are kept running, the country itself is kept running mostly by the strength of those lower at the bottom rungs of the pecking order, whose skills and knowledge and abilities keep the country going, not the skills, knowledge, and abilities of the enormously overpaid CEOs and leaders of society who just appear to do very little at the moment of any great use. And it's the cooks, the cleaners, the nurses, the people who are not terribly well paid, who are keeping the country going. A little bit of politics there. So that's the chief appearance of the wren in Celtic sources or European mythological sources. A more Celtic-specific source is the Cutty Wren, which is a tradition held in some parts of the country on Boxing Day, where parades take place. And allegedly, once upon a time, these parades involved an actual wren, or dead wren, obviously, that had been nailed to a wooden pole and would be carried around as a sort of figurehead by parades of lads who would go from door to door collecting money or food or whatever else they could manage to get hold of. These days, the parades still take place, but obviously RSPB and all of that, it's no longer a wren that has been nailed to a plank. In fact, nothing is nailed to a plank anymore. These days, it's a wooden pole with a cage and a pretend wren. I don't know if they make it out of wood or paper mache or whatever they make it out of these days, but a pretend wren is carried around in a cage. How that tradition started, why somebody should have allegedly wanted to nail a wren to a pole of wood, I have no idea. But that's one of these practices that goes back to a point in history where no one can quite remember exactly how it started or why it started. It might tie in with the sort of mythology that's very popular in Wiccan groups of the Oak King and the Holly King, who are associated with the solstices, the summer solstice and the winter solstice, as the turning points in the year where the summer king, the Holly King, the Oak King takes over from the Winter King, the Holly King, at the winter solstice, and vice versa at the summer solstice. So when one is at the peak, then the next one kind of comes in as a growing force, just as the one at the peak goes down, the one that was at their nadir, their lowest point, goes up in strength and prominence. And they are, as well as the two trees, the holly tree and the oak tree, they're associated with the wren and the robin as representatives of summer and winter. That appears to be a tradition of relatively recent invention, although there are myths that are not dissimilar that involve a conflict between a summer deity and a winter deity. The idea that every culture should have this summer-winter conflict, and therefore lots and lots of gods can be labelled as being of the Oak King archetype or the Holly King archetype. That archetypal notion is something that's come about in the years since Carl Jung wrote his book on archetypes. And so it's a modern interpretation of what might be an older tradition going back in time. So one of the interpretations laid on, sticking with Celtic sources, on Welsh myth, for example, is that the battle that takes place between Gwyn ap Nudd, who's a very wintry figure, and Gwythyr, who is a summery figure, for the hand of Caithnach, who is the sister of Gwyn and the betrothed of Gwythyr, is seen as, by a lot of Wiccans at least, is seen as part and parcel of this Oak King, Holly King, and those modern day Druid orders that are very in sync with Wiccan thinking also tend to interpret that myth in that way. Other people interpret it in different ways, but that's one of the ways in which that story can be interpreted and understood. So the wren here can be seen as a figure associated with this sort of summery time of year and the growing might of the Oak King as the Lord of Summer, if you wish to come at it from that angle. In terms of the colour Ogham, here we have Duir, black. Black obviously lends itself to thoughts of nighttime, of sleep, which is rather contrary to the oak association with the Oak King of Summer, when everything is very bright and the days are at their longest. It's associated with energy and being alert and awake and so forth. So a bit of a contrast there. We could think of black here in maybe the context of the soil, the darkness of the soil, the darkness of the earth in which the oak tree is rooted, but then so are all other trees rooted in the darkness of the earth. You can get a black dye out of the oak tree, the dyeing cloth, so that is probably the more likely association. That and the simple fact that the word for black in Gaelic begins with the letter D, so there's this sort of alliterative association going on of selecting things specifically beginning with the same letter. In terms of colour symbolism, black does have an overlay of association with death, but that is only specific to some cultures. Other cultures, different colours are associated with death and funerals and what is appropriate to wear at funerals. So black became a colour particularly associated with the funerals during the Victorian era as a fashion statement made by Queen Victoria herself following the death of Albert. Prior to that, other colours had been associated with death. There are a variety of dark-robed, black-cloaked figures that crop up in Irish myth, and dark-haired, black-haired figures that crop up in Irish myth. One of the particularly interesting ones, which I think maybe fits more readily with the imagery of the oak, the hugeness, the size, the scale of a big mature oak tree. A number of characters, or various different names, but all quite similar, of giants who appear, huge, great, shaggy, burly giants who live deep in the woods and come out, and they're often very scruffy and peculiar and carry massive axes and clubs and what have you, and come to challenge the heroes. So in one particular story, one of these figures challenges Cuchulainn, and there's various other heroes that get challenged by these giants as well, who invariably turn out to be benevolent figures. And it's a little bit like the Beauty and the Beast story, with the thing that appears to be the scary monster, the scary beast, eventually towards the end of the story turns out to be quite a kindly figure, a benevolent figure. And the frightening face and huge size and the sort of monster appearance is a challenge to the heroine in the case of Beauty and the Beast, or the hero in the case of Cuchulainn and the various other male warriors who encounter these scruffy giants in the forest. So they have to get beyond the outer appearance to see deeper into the goodness of the character. And a lot of these scruffy giants invariably turn out to be rather, I was going to say Cernunnos-like figures, because Cernunnos is a Gaulish name rather than an Irish name. Figures who are guardians of forests, guardians of the wild animals, guardians of the trees. So somewhat in keeping with the Gaulish idea, well, quite a lot in keeping with the Gaulish idea of Cernunnos as the god of the wild places, the god of forests, god of wild animals and stags and so on. These grim appearance deities are the protectors of the forest, and if the lead character of the story can get past the scary appearance, they find the good side of the guardian of the forest. And maybe that's kind of reflective, I think, maybe of human experience. I can remember certainly back in the day when forests were vast, and there were bears and wolves and wild boars and quite dangerous creatures, and you could get lost for days in the forest, not like today in Britain, where forests are hacked back to next to nothing. But millennia ago, when forests were vast and dangerous places, they would have been actually scary places to go into. And certainly you wouldn't want to get lost in the forest, because you might not live long enough to come back out again. And so that frightening outward appearance. But once you learn the ways of the forest, you find all of the good things in the forest, sources of food, sources of wood, sources of fuel. You find the spirits of the forest, you work with the spirits of the forest, you get on the side of it, and you see the goodness beneath the frightening exterior. That's how I interpret it anyway, in that way. The skill Ogham, or art Ogham as it's sometimes referred to in the old-fashioned sense of art, which just meant skill rather than painting necessarily. The word associated is Dreacht, which translates literally as Druidry, but the medieval glosses normally translated into wizardry, because by the medieval period, Druids had become thought of more as wizards than as priests. So that the religious context, so these were the priests of the ancient religion, had faded into the background, and it was more that kind of slightly Merlin, Harry Potter thing going on there, that they were masters of magic and would cast spells with their wands and conjure rains of fire and shoot lightning bolts out their fingers and all that palaver. So you can interpret it either as druidry, the skill and the craft of the old priests, or you can interpret it more as wizardry, magic, knowledge of spells and such like things. The deity, or one of the deities most closely associated in Irish law with Draocht, with druidry, was the Dagda, who again, like the big scruffy giant we were just mentioning a couple of minutes ago, was a huge burly giant. That's how he's described by the medieval period, when he's become more human in appearance. And he drags that huge iron club, which may possibly have been made of oak wood originally, because oak is as tough as iron, in a sense, and can eat and consume iron nails. If you bang iron nails into an oak tree, the naturally occurring acids within the oak will eat away and devour the nails over the course of time, and there'll be no nail left. That's how strong oak is. So the Dagda is part and parcel, and some people have speculated that the Dagda might be an Irish spin, an Irish name for Cernunnos, a kind of a comparable deity. So even though the Dagda isn't described as having antlers, the way the pictures of who is assumed to be Cernunnos in the Gundestrup Cauldron has, nonetheless, he is a lord of wild places. He's a lord of druidry, and he's this big, huge, burly, quite scruffy, comically dressed figure. From the Wildwood, you can imagine him as a sort of like the image of a druidic hermit who lives deep in the woods, studying the mysticisms of nature, and occasionally returns to the community as this wild figure with leaves in his hair and twigs in his beard, and delivers prophecies and comes to heal the sick, and really scares the living daylights out of people, but has the goodness underneath. So we have a link here to the Dagda as a deity tied into the oak and tied into druidry particularly, and the skills there. In terms of the number symbolism, I mentioned it's the number 7, the 7th letter. That crops up in various different contexts. So there is a story of yet another giant, Trocher. The significant difference here is that Trocher is a very beautiful giant rather than a scruffy, scary giant. Trocher turns up and meets with one of the High Kings of Ireland. He is described as being as tall as the trees, tall as the woods, very beautiful and elegantly dressed, a sort of a catwalk model, a Brad Pitt type of a giant. And he is the wisest and the most knowledgeable being going. And he says he wants to teach his wisdoms to the people of Ireland. And so he asks that each of the 4 major kingdoms sends the 7 wisest people in their kingdom to meet with him on the hill of Tara at the centre, the 5th, the smallest, tiniest kingdom in Ireland. And so the 4, or the 7 from each quarter, 28 altogether, obviously, they come in and they sit at his feet, and for however long it takes, he sits and tells them his wisdoms, his knowledge of medicine and law and architecture and astronomy and every subject going under the sun. And having learned all of these wonderful wisdoms, they all say, "Oh, thank you very much, that's smashing and marvellous." And just as they're about to go back to their kingdoms, he takes his staff, which is this huge, great branch of wood, and it's a magic branch of wood, naturally enough. So magic, it grows upon it the fruit of 3 different trees rather than 1 tree, which you can actually achieve through grafting, but this is possibly magic rather than grafting going on there. So it has growing upon it apples, acorns, and hazelnuts. So the fruit of 3 different trees growing upon it, and the giant plucks 5 of the fruit of the tree and gives 1 to each of the groups from the 4 kingdoms, and he plants the 5th in the middle kingdom in near the hill of Tara. And so the four groups, they all go off back home and they plant their respective seeds that they've been given, and each of these seeds grows into one of these huge magical trees, one of these great sacred trees. And I'm sure if we went back in time, we would have found lots and lots of stories connected to those trees. Unfortunately, hardly any of those stories have survived, or at least maybe they are written in old Irish in manuscripts mouldering in the bottom of universities that no one's ever bothered translating yet. So one day we might get those stories, who knows. Those trees, they grow and grow and grow for centuries until they all die in the same year. And it's the year in which two brothers have joint high kingship of Ireland. The reason why those trees all die in the same year is not stated, or at least not in the surviving scraps of the story that are with us. Undoubtedly, there would have been some story of why they all died in that year, in the middle 600s. But we just don't know what that story is anymore, unfortunately. Whether it was the fault of the two kings, the two brothers, or it was somebody else's fault, or whatever it was. And I dare say there must have been some sense of, now the trees are gone, such and such a thing will happen. And quite what the such and such a thing was, I don't know, but it has the flavour of a rather gloomy omen about it, the falling of the sacred trees. One of the trees that was planted is the tree of Muna, which, due to the ambiguity of the language in the manuscript, could either be an oak tree or a yew tree. It's not wholly clear which one it is. So it's possibly an oak tree, or possibly a yew tree. Most of them are ash trees, but of the five, mostly ash trees. But anyway, they're the five sacred trees of Ireland. So this might have been one of them. So that the seven wise people from each quarter. So this knowledge that they would take back the information the giant had given them and disseminate it to their people. The seven sages from each of the four directions, each of the four kingdoms. So it's connected to knowledge, to learning, if you like, to Druidry. Who would the seven wisest people in each kingdom have been? Well, it doesn't state explicitly that there were Druids, but you kind of take that as read, I think, almost, that the wisest people would be assumed to be the Druids in each kingdom. So the seven wisest Druids go away with knowledge. And the number seven has significance for hierarchy. We know with the Urchekbek, which is almost like I suppose you could describe it as like a trade union manual sort of thing, in that it talks about different jobs, different trades, and the skills. Each trade has 7 tiers, where you go from apprentice to master as you work your way up the 7 tiers. And so it says at this tier you must know X, Y, Z things in order to qualify. And it also goes into things like payments that can be expected of people, for people at each tier. So if you are a 3rd tier poet, this is how many poems you must know to qualify, and this is the kind of treatment you should expect, or payment you should get from the Lord of the Manor when he invites you in to recite poems for him. It goes into all that kind of career-based detail. Why everything has 7? Well, some people have speculated that within the church, or at least certain branches of the church, bearing in mind you've got Orthodox and Catholic and so forth, at certain points in church history, the hierarchy of the church was in 7 layers, from sort of parish priest upwards, bishops and cardinals and what have you, working your way up the hierarchy of the church. Why was the church in 7 layers? Well, did the church inherit the idea of, did they start the idea of 7 hierarchies and bring it to Ireland? Or did the church acquire the hierarchy of 7 from an older source? Well, there are, within the Bible, there are things in groups of 7 that crop up, as 7 deadly sins, 7 virtues, etc., etc. So the number 7 has a significance within the Bible, but then it has a significance in a lot of other non-Christian cultures as well. So whether it went from Christianity to other cultures or vice versa, where it's just one of those synchronous things that happen in the world where different cultures come up with the same idea at the same time, So it's not that one gives it to the other; they're just sort of, the way the human mind works. It comes up with the same ideas at the same time, possibly so. In astrology of that period, because people didn't have telescopes with which to see Pluto and Neptune and so forth, they spoke of the 7 planets: the Sun, the Moon, Mercury, Mars, Venus, Jupiter, and Saturn. The 7 astrological forces. And I know the Sun isn't a planet, but that's the way it was described in astrology at the period. And we know the Druids engaged in astrology. There's lots of references to them doing so. We don't know the names they gave to the signs or the planets, but we know that they studied the stars. So the number 7 could derive from there that sense of the 7 most important factors, the 7 most important influences. Caesar, when he arrived in ancient Gaul and was trashing the place, and then went on to write his Gallo Bellica, the Conquest of Gaul book, justifying himself, talks of the major gods of the Gauls. And he talks about there being this kind of pantheon, and he never names what the Gaulish names. He never says what the Gaulish names are for the pantheon, but he says, well, this one is a bit like this Roman god, and that one is a bit like that Roman god. So we know the Roman equivalents, and he talks about one of them being like Minerva, the goddess of crafts and industry and looking after home and wisdom and strategy and so on. So many people have speculated that might have been perhaps Brigantia, or a similar goddess to Brigantia. He talks about the god of the sky, and talks about the god of the war, a god like Zeus and a god like Mars, and so on. And there's a set of 7 major deities that he alludes to. So that could have been the sort of, if there were a pantheon of 7 principal deities and lots of other more regional deities, but 7 widespread deities, and the Druids had been trying to unite the tribes in Gaul, and maybe Ireland, maybe Britain, who knows, they might have said, well, as well as your local goddess of the river and your local god of the hill, and your local god of this and your local god of that, there is also these big 7. And that's all. So whether you are Iceni, or whether you are Trinovanti, or whether you are Siluri, or whatever you are, as well as your local gods, let's all join forces with the big 7. There's this notion that just prior to the Roman invasion, maybe the Druids were starting to unite tribes, not quite developing a pan-Celtic empire, but maybe a step towards unity between the tribes, was a kind of a core commonality of deities. So there'd be a core set of gods as well as the local ones, peculiar to this tribe, but not worshipped by that tribe. Maybe this was part and parcel of that, which, if we're thinking kingship, queenship, leadership, it's about power and structure of hierarchies and unity and bringing people together under common goals and common ideas and common leadership. There is an element of that. And worth noting that Caesar is one of several people who gives the opinion that even though you've got these, they talk about the Gauls and these other tribes, even though you've got the king, the local king, or occasionally the local queen, the real power behind the throne, he says, are the Druids. They are the ones, they're not sitting on the throne, they have the power behind the throne, giving guidance and direction to the chieftains, and that the chieftains effectively would never go against the council of the Druids, because that would just be disastrous. So again, the notion that the Druids themselves are a kind of backroom power underpinning society at the time. What else? We have Clatga. In the Hill of Clatga, there is the story of a bard who is in conflict with the other bards of Ireland to see who is the greatest poet and wordsmith in Ireland. And there are 8 bards kind of competing with each other, going in handbags waving, going at each other, trying to see who's going to be the best. One of them wins out. And part of his triumph, his victory tour, if you like, is to cut out the tongues of the other 7 and bury them beneath the Hill of Clatga, which is a big sacred hill. Kind of a counterpoint to the Hill of Tara. And he goes and stands on the hill and says, I now control the 7 tongues of my opponents. Huzzah. Now, you could take that as very literal. Maybe this is a reference to an historical event. There are accounts. One of the Russian Tsars had the tongues of the storytellers cut out because he wanted the whole of Russia to be hardline Christian. And he didn't like all the folklore that the storytellers were keeping alive. So he had their tongues cut out to put an end to their ability to spread stories they didn't want to hear. So there are certainly real life cases of people having their tongues removed, and maybe this is a distant memory of something like that actually happening. And obviously, if you cut someone's tongue out, you silence them, you stop them talking. So you could silence them in the sense of they are no longer rivals or competition to you because they can't recite poetry anymore. They've got no tongues left to recite poetry with. So it could be a ruthless move, a power struggle in which a horribly ruthless individual silences, cuts out the tongues of his enemies. Or, if you want a slightly gentler interpretation, the fact that he stands on the hill and their tongues are under the hill, maybe this means that their tongues are no longer wagging against him, they're now wagging for him. So he is the master of their tongues. So he's not actually cut their tongues out, he's just kind of, by winning the contest, he's proved his worth, and now everyone supports him and talks for him rather than talks against him. And so, if you want to put it in a modern Christian idiom, they're all singing from the same song, hymn sheet, kind of talking in unison rather than in conflict, perhaps. And power, I suppose we could understand power, kingship, any sort of leadership as either being achieved through sheer ruthless dominance of slaughtering your enemies, or by getting everyone in unity, everyone singing together rather than screeching and cackling and cacophony and conflict. Interpret that either way. The word for a king or a leader, well, I say king, the word for a head, the head of state, the head of the tribe, is in Gaelic ken and in Welsh pen. So essentially the same word with the PQ language distinctions. It's also the word for the actual head on top of your neck. So much as in English you would say the head, but you'd also say the headmaster, the headmistress, head teacher. There's a medical book that has survived from Ireland which talks of the 7 openings of the head. So the 7 openings of the head are the 2 eyes, the 2 ears, the 2 nostrils, and your mouth. Those are the 7 openings by which information goes into your head through your senses, but also, of course, through the power of speech, comes back out again through your mouth. So that we can just take that as a very, kind of bit of literalism. The head does indeed have 7. You can sniff in, you can take in vision, you can take in sound, you can take in taste. It has those orifices upon it. But we could also maybe consider this as metaphoric. So if it's the head as in head of state, as well as the head of the body, then does the head of state have 7 openings, as it were? How would we understand those openings? Well, if we're talking something comparable to the 7 senses, maybe high kings made a point of having 7 counsellors, 7 kind of wise old Watsits around them to give them advice and guidance and keep an eye on the kingdom. So maybe they made a point that they should, rather than having 6 of them or 10 of them or 15 of them or however many, maybe 7 might have been the given number, a kind of a poetic number, that you have the king with their 7 openings, as it were, the 7 sources of information coming in, and the mouth going out, so that the herald perhaps delivering the messages of the king and making formal announcements on behalf of the king or on behalf of the queen. Perhaps that's just me speculating. I've got no historical evidence to back that one up with, but that's just possible speculation. St. Bridget, the Christian saint, talks about the Anam Cara, the soul friend, and says a person without a soul friend, this kind of spiritual bosom buddy to whom you confide your deepest secrets, she says, is like a body without a head. So the friend of the soul, and you think of the relationship between the king and the druid. The druid is the Anam Cara to the king, the soul friend, the wisdom, the source of information. The king or the queen is the muscle, the power, the political might, the political clout, but the druid is the wise Watsit who provides the guidance and the wisdom and the knowledge, is the sage, the counsellor. So a king with no druid to guide them is like a body without a head. And as St. Bridget says, it doesn't just apply to kings, it applies to everyone. If you have a soul friend, a companion of your spirit, and part of that, in Christian times, it became kind of overlapped with the idea of a confessor, someone to whom you would make confession. And it was one of the disputes between the Celtic churches and the Roman Church, was this issue of who was allowed to take confession from someone and give absolution accordingly. The Roman approach is only a priest can take confession and give absolution. The Celtic churches had slightly different takes, and those takes might have stemmed from earlier times and pagan ideas that had seeped into Christianity in Ireland and Wales and so on. Perhaps speculative again. So someone in whom to confide, in whom to find guidance, wisdom, insight. Sticking with Bruges, there are place names in Ireland which derive from the word oak. Apparently there's well over 1,000 places in Ireland that derive their name from the word oak. I'm going to give you two of them here, just as examples. One is Derry in Ireland. There's a comedy at the moment called Derry Girls. I've seen clips of it, it's quite funny. It's about a convent school. So Derry comes from the word for oak. But Kildare also comes from the word for oak, and Kildare is the place where St. Bridget had her abbey. And Kildare, literally Kile church, means church of the oak. So the story goes, the Christian story, that back before she had become a saint, when she was just a nun, she'd gone along to one of the local chieftains and said, I would like some land on which to build a monastery. And he said, of course you can, love, you can have as much land as your cloak can cover. And she went, fair enough. And she did her almost druidy style magic, or saintly magic if you prefer. She took her cloak off and flapped it and flapped it and flapped it, and by magic, by a miracle, the cloak ended up the size of 3 dozen football pitches and covered this enormous area. And she said, well, there you go, kingy. You said I could have as much land as my cloak can cover. Well, I'm having that much land. And of course, as in so many stories, a promise is a promise is a promise, and the king couldn't back out. And so she got this enormous great chunk of land to build her monastery on. And in the early days, it was a cohabiting monastery, that is to say there were monks and nuns in the same place. Back when under Irish rule, nuns and monks could marry if they wanted to have kids and so on. But there was an area of the abbey in which the sacred flame of Bridget was kept burning, and only the nuns were allowed to feed the wood into the fire. None of the monks or priests or abbots or any other man could go into the glade where the fire was kept perpetually burning, which obviously you will be familiar with from 101 Imbolc rituals over the years. Well, maybe not 101, but a lot of Imbolc rituals over the years. Was that a glade of oak trees? Possibly. Why was it called the Church of the Oak? Well, there must have been a really big, important oak there, at least one, if not several big, important oaks there at some point. And the implication is that, as with so often this kind of early Christianity, that the tendency to take over previous pagan sacred sites and incorporate them into the new faith. If there was a big old oak tree, that oak tree was much older than the church, or the arrival of Christianity in Ireland. So was that once a Druid site? And it then simply kind of migrated into being a Christian site. So it had been a Druid oak and it became a Christian oak, perhaps. Or a glade of oaks, a grove of oaks, rather than just the one. Maybe. Speculation. But again, along with Bruges, because we have this overlap, it's always difficult to tell whether stories of Saint Bridget begin and the stories of the goddess Bridget end. There's that blurry patch in the middle. So were the oaks once sacred to the goddess Bridget, Bruges, and then became part of the tradition of Saint Bridget? Or is this just sheer conflation of unrelated ideas? Who can say? The other mention or at least the one that I'm going to make here, I'm sure there must be plenty of other mentions. But the other one I'll include here about the number 7 is in law. So we've got this very useful book, A Guide to Early Irish Law by Kelly. And he gives some translations. There's lots, number symbolism crops up a lot in Irish law and the burial law, different numbers in different contexts. One of them is the number 7. There are various laws organised in heptads, sets of 7. And I'll give you a couple of examples. I won't go into great detail, but just to give you very brief examples of some of the heptads that Kelly's got in his book. So, for example, heptad 6 gives 7 cases where the shedding of blood is not regarded as a crime. And then it goes into details about what those 7 ones are. Heptad 15, there are 7 women in Irish law who are not entitled to an honour price if they are offended against because they're not regarded as very nice women for various reasons. The heptad number 1, there are 7 church buildings that don't have to be given money out of local taxes for their upkeep. And partly that's to do if those buildings are being left to rack and ruin and so on, or if the person in charge of that building falls rather short on their vows of celibacy, then they forego money from the local chieftain's coffers. There's loads of other heptads. Now, were those heptads to reflect the 7 structures of the church? Were they to reflect the 7 planets of astrology? Were they to reflect possibly the 7 chief deities of, well, in Gaul, but maybe possibly they had 7 chief deities in very early Ireland as well? Who knows? It could come from any number of sources and have worked its way into law, but clearly seen as a kind of an important organising concept and number. Briara Owen gives these 3 little lines, nothing particularly exciting or meaty here. Highest of bushes, carpenter's work, higher than bushes is oak. Now, in the poem referred to as the Law of Neighbours, I won't read it here, we have gone over it ages ago, and we'll probably go over it again at some point. It deals with the legal status of trees, the Law of Neighbours, and says you can collect this type of wood willy-nilly, but that type of wood you need permission to go and cut branches down, permission from the local chieftain to go and cut down that type of wood because that's a very special tree, so you can't just chop it up willy-nilly. And there's all sorts of other little bits of folklore worked into the poem as well as actual outright law. And it divides trees into a number of different categories. The more important the tree, the bigger the fine somebody has to pay if they chop it down without permission. So the lowest ranking with the lowest fine that has to be paid if the law is broken is a category referred to as bushes. Now, that's not necessarily bushes in the way a botanist these days would define bushes, but they're just classed as bushes. The highest rank, or the biggest scale of fine, are the chieftain trees. The oak is one of the chieftain trees, and so in saying highest of bushes, you've got both the legal imagery that the chieftain tree is more important than the bush tree, but also obviously the very bog standard physical fact that oak trees grow very, very tall. And so they're bigger than most other things in the forest. An oak tree left to its own devices will grow for around 900, or live rather for around 900 years. First 300 years are growing up. The second 300 years are stabilizing and kind of growing out, getting broader and wider in the trunk. And the last 300 years are as it's getting old and bits are dropping off and decaying the way they do with all of us as we get older and older. And eventually it dies. They can live long, but you can get a 1,000-year-old oak tree, but 900 years is the average lifespan. And we have almost no 900-year-old oak trees left in Britain because King Henry VIII had all of the really big oak trees chopped down. I say all of them, almost all of them, chopped down to make boats and ships, because oak is such a strong, tough wood. It led to the image of the wooden wall of Britain, the navy, the ships protecting the island of Britain. So it's very rare to find an oak tree that survived King Henry VIII. In his favour, we have to note he did order that new oak trees be planted to replace the ones chopped down. So at least he had some degree of environmental awareness. Carpenter's work, sawing up the oak planks to make ships. The word door comes from Duir, because doors, at least if you had a big grand house and you could afford a big solid oak door to it, that was really hard if pirates turned up, or brigands or whatever, and they were trying to axe the door in. It's very difficult to get through an oak door because they're so bloody solid. So it gives you a lot more protection, and obviously that's for those who are rich enough to have stuff worth protecting. If you're a peasant, you have nothing much to make in the first place. Not quite so much need for an oak door. Well, it will protect your life, if not protect property. And we can take door also, of course, in a more mystical sense, like a portal, an entry point between one world and the other. And so we have various different stories in Celtic tradition and other cultures as well, of course, of portals between dimensions and worlds, places, not necessarily oak trees, but places of egress and transgress, of people going from one realm to the other realm and passing between these different what shall I call them, zones of reality. The land of the fairies and the land of people, or the land of the dead and the land of the living. Places of transition, places of change. And so perhaps if you're doing a reading, a divination reading or something, and Duir comes up, it could signify issues of leadership, maybe somebody getting a promotion at work, or someone who's a very bad leader if it's adversely kind of placed in the reading, that they're more the cut the tongues out type of tyrant than they are the unify everyone into the singing from the same hymn sheet type of leader. So you could see it in that connection. The oak is often referred to as the father of the forest, so it could signify a father figure, a common poetic image for the oak tree. And obviously, an oak tree, a huge big old oak tree, has a vast number of creatures living on it and depending on it: insects, squirrels, birds, burrowing animals amongst the roots, worms, and not to mention pigs eating the acorns, and humans can eat acorns if you cook them and properly prepare them first. If you don't properly prepare them, they can become poisonous if you eat them in sufficient quantity. But during the war, they were used for making substitute coffee, for example. So they have to be properly prepared for that, but you can use them in that context, as well as various other contexts. So it can represent perhaps a kind of fatherly presence, a supporter, a nurturer of their offspring, guardian, protector, particularly maybe someone who is a bit grim and fierce, like the giants. Someone who's I suppose slightly like a Victorian father, who's maybe a little bit fierce on the outside, but very kind and caring underneath it. And so, depending on the context in which it appears, it could be sort of saying, well, try to look beyond appearances. This person has scared the crap out of you, but try to look beyond appearances and you'll realise that there is a lot of kindness underneath that rather fierce exterior. There is a kind of a prince beneath the beast, if you like to put it in such terms. Or we could have this angle of a doorway, of a route of movement from place to place, but maybe that is better suited to the notion of chanting, of magic, and of kind of opening a doorway to enter into another world. And if you are thinking in terms of path working, trance work, that sort of thing, you could visualize your gateway as being, you visualize an oak tree and you sit against the oak tree and you melt into the oak tree and the oak becomes the portal by which you enter the trance state. That could be one approach to its more mystical usage. I think I've run out of things to say now, and I'm very rapidly running out of voice. Or the other bit I mentioned, the last bit. I mentioned the Dagda, I mentioned Brige in Welsh mythology. We have the story of Lladaiweth and Llai, who, at least linguistically, even if not much in temperament and character, linguistically links to the Irish Lugh and the ancient Proto-Celtic name of Lugus. So the personalities aren't much like, and there's no direct comparison story in Irish myth to the Welsh story of Lladaiweth and Llai. At least not one that survived, at any rate. Let's put it like that. but linguistically the names are connected. So, quick summary. I know you're all familiar with the story, but just a brief recap. Llydaewith is given in marriage to Llai, and doesn't have a lot of say in it, as I dare say. A lot of medieval women have virtually no say in their marriages. She gets fed up with Llai, who's always out hunting, shooting, and fishing, and she falls in love with somebody else entirely that she meets, Gronw Pebir. And again, a lot of people go for the Holly King, Oak King interpretation for the Wiccans reading this story, and some Druids reading this story go for that interpretation of the two men as summer and winter. But she falls in love with Gronw Pebir, and they plot to do away with her husband, to do away with Llai, but they can only do it in a really convoluted, bizarre fashion. But they succeed, and Gronw Pebir hurls a spirit in which sticks in Llai, but he doesn't die. He doesn't die. He transforms into an eagle. So back to eagles again. And he flies off, dripping blood and what have you from the wound, from the spear. And he's not seen again for a long time until his uncle, who might possibly also be his father, because there's a slight hint of incest in the story, Gwydion tracks down his vanished nephew or son, depending on how you interpret it, and eventually follows the trail of a magical pig, and eventually comes to a huge old oak tree in the back of beyond. And sitting in the branches of this huge old oak tree is the eagle, still bleeding and dripping maggots from the festering wound. It's all a bit manky. And he lures the bird down and uses magic to change Llai back from a bird to a human shape and to heal the wound, and then the story continues. But that's the key bit for the relevance here, is that it's an oak tree that Llai is contained within. Now, by the time the medieval story of Llydaewith and Llai is being recorded, or it's being recorded in medieval times, Llydaewith is a kind of like a fairy figure, but Llai is quite human. He's a prince. He's quite ordinary. He's no longer a godlike figure. And the assumption, it is an assumption for a number of historians and mythographers and whatnot, is that this is a medieval version of a much older story. And that if we were able to go back, jump on the time disc, go back in time and hear the much older version of the story, Llai and Llydaewith and the rest of them would have been gods rather than kings and princes and queens and whatnot. Would have been much more spiritual figures rather than human figures, perhaps. So as well as the eagle connection, we have the oak as the sanctuary of this prince, this betrayed prince, who might well be connected to Lugus, the ancient British god of trade, of skills, of craftsmanship, who in his Irish version is seen as coming from the east to meet with the gods in a bright light coming in. So he's like the dawn sun spreading across the land, coming towards the hill of Tara. So perhaps an association with light. The name Lugus also associates with the word for an oath taker, so a god who watched over the making and taking of oaths, which was a huge significance in ancient society. And maybe the oak was his tree as well. He's kind of his refuge, his sanctuary, his go-to place when he was in need and injured and the rest of it. The place where his kingship, his leadership, Llai's leadership was restored to him. Eventually, when his uncle finds him and works his magic. So we can interpret it in that. And oak trees, it's worth noting, are the tree most likely to be struck by lightning because they're so damn big. So the lightning blasted oak takes on a significance in a lot of folklore the world over. And a lot of cultures associate the oak tree with whichever of their gods is associated with storms, thunder and lightning and so forth. So there is the possibility that one or other of the deities we've mentioned, Brij, Dagda, Lugus, might have had a connection originally to lightning, thunder, storms. It's not an obvious connection that's persisted in surviving stories and mythology, but there might have been a connection there once upon a time. because of the association with the oak tree. It's stretching it a little bit, admittedly, but perhaps an association there that's worth considering and contemplating, in a bit of meditation with them, a bit of communion with them, see what they say to you in meditation, and take it from there. But I think that's more than enough waffle from me. My throat is going, too much talking, so I'll end it there. And any questions, well, you know how to get hold of me.